I want to ask, what is the one word or perhaps phrase that most typifies your idea of God, and what are the associated images? What role does God play? When you think of God, how do you think of him? Maybe think of it this way. If I could sum up my view of God in one word or phrase, it would be, I see God as, what is it and how do you see him? Maybe what's the first thing that pops into your head when you think about the person of God? Maybe it's divine gatekeeper, or it's lawgiver or judge. Maybe it's grandfather, either a grumpy old grandfather or a delightful old grandfather. Maybe it's grandmother, a delightful old grandmother or a grumpy old grandmother. I actually have a friend who envisions God as his grandmother because she was the kindest, most influential and loving person in his life. Now, I don't have an axe to grind here. Don't get too uptight about this. I remember when the book The Shack came out and the author described God as an African-American woman and Jesus as a Middle Eastern man and the Holy Spirit as an Asian woman. People got real uptight about that. And we don't need to do that. We understand that God is not male or female. He's not in that kind of shape. God is spirit, and all of femaleness and all of maleness is wrapped up into who he is, and that gets expressed in who we are, even while the pronouns that refer to him throughout Scripture are male pronouns, and I don't have a problem with that. But what is it that you see? What is the picture that you see when you think about God? How do you see him? Maybe as a police officer or as a schoolmaster or a professor. Maybe it's a CEO. Maybe it's father. What picture is helpful to you? I ask because your view of God, my view of God, and the associated images are really important in our relationship to God. Dallas Willard wrote that our ideas about God and their associated images are the most important thing about us. And maybe you're curious about why I would start a sermon on prayer with our images of God. I'm going to be spending some time on prayer over the next few weeks. But the reality is that your prayer life begins with your thought life. Now, people want to say, I don't want to get caught up in theology and all that intellectual stuff. I just want to love God. But once you've said that, you're doing theology. Theology, in its most basic form, is thinking about God. And C.S. Lewis says that everything turns on theology. The way you think about God impacts everything about who you are and how you relate. So whether you're doing theology lazily or thoughtfully, your thinking about God is theology, and it is impacting your relationship with him. Your prayer life is deeply influenced by your thought life. You know, as I've been really challenged that the church needs to return to being a house of prayer, I want us to spend some time on that topic and between now and Easter. What does it look like for the church to be a house of prayer? I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts on this topic, actually. So you can go to your virtual journey card if you're watching us online, or you can pick one out of the seat back in your chair if you're here watching this personally and in person. But I'd love to hear you what you think about that. What does it look like for the church to be a house of prayer? And send that to us. We'd love to see what that is. I'd also love to hear about what you think you might be able to do to help engage MLCC in prayer as a house of prayer, to enhance our being a place of prayer. But I want to start with our personal prayer life and move out from there, beginning with two prayers of Jesus. You know the first one pretty well. It's famous. It's the Lord's Prayer. We find it in Matthew chapter 6, verses 9 through 13. In fact, let's say it together. You know it. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And many of us have learned this prayer, and it's important. But I also want to draw you to another, less popular prayer of Jesus, found in Mark chapter 14, verse 32 through 42. I'll read that whole section to give you context to the prayer, and then we'll focus in on verse 36. The text says, and when they went to the place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. And going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And he came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, Simon, why are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray, that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came a third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour is come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. We find Jesus here at one of the most, if not the most intense moments of his earthly life, in the garden, facing the suffering that was going to come at the cross and at the scourging and the trial. In Luke, we have an even more intense account of the moment. Luke chapter 22, verses 41 through 44. Luke's account says, and he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And so what does Jesus teach us in this other Lord's Prayer, the one that he prayed in the garden? We know that Jesus prayed a lot. It was a regular part of his routine, but certainly the Lord's Prayer is the most popular and well-known of his prayers. So I'd like to call attention to the prayer in the garden, or the other Lord's Prayer just now, because we learn some really important things about how to pray here as well. The first thing that's interesting to notice is that Jesus prays in nearly the exact same pattern that he teaches the disciples in the Lord's Prayer. Look at how they stack up. Our Father who art in heaven, and Abba, Father. It's the personality of God. It talks about the role and the person of God. Hallowed be thy name. And nothing is impossible for you. He's talking here about character. In the Lord's Prayer, his holiness and majesty. And in the prayer in the garden, it's the God with all power, for whom nothing is impossible. Give us this day our daily bread. And then take this cup from me. This is the request. This is the ask that Jesus is making. And thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And in the garden, yet not what I will, but what you will. It's this surrender. And so we see the pattern of Jesus praying is fairly similar here as it was as he gives the Lord's Prayer. But we can notice a few other things with regard to how Jesus sees his relationship with God. In the Lord's Prayer, he says, God is hallowed. Hallowed be thy name. That's this holiness, this holy other. In the garden, it is Abba, Father. Here's the picture that Jesus seems to most identify with in his relationship with God. He is Son and God is Father. Abba is an Aramaic word that means Papa or Daddy. Jesus reveals here the intimate relationship between himself and the Father. This is interestingly the same terminology that Paul encourages us to use in relationship with God. In Romans chapter 8:15, he says, for you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. It's a beautiful picture. In Galatians chapter 4:6, Paul also says, and because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. There's this outcrying of our heart, this outpouring of our heart for our Father. I'll tell you that for me, the most descriptive word for my relationship with God, for the way that I view him, and what informs my theology the most is the word Father. First, because of my own relationship with my dad, but also as a father. I'll never forget the moment that each of the Wild Boys was placed into my arms and that overwhelming sense of love and gratitude that I immediately had for them. When our oldest son was born, I remember him being handed to me, and I remember at that moment thinking, this is how God thinks of me. It was a beautiful picture to me. I begin now to experience a slightly different role as grandfather, as Papa. I could say more about that, but I'll leave that here for another day. I do want to acknowledge that the image of father is not the most helpful image for some people, for a variety of reasons, maybe their own experience with their father, or maybe not growing up with a father. But we see here in relationship with God, it isn't a cold and calculating agreement or arrangement, but a warm and affectionate one in which he sees God as Papa, as someone to draw near to. The second thing we notice as Jesus approaches the Father is his understanding of who God is and what he can do. Nothing is impossible for you, he says. In the Lord's Prayer, he highlights God's holiness, but here he highlights God's power. Multiple times in the Gospels, Jesus refers to God as the one who can do all things. Nothing is impossible for him. And I would simply say here that you have to come to terms with what you believe God is able and willing to do if you're going to grow in your life of prayer. You will not ask for what you believe God is either unwilling or unable to do. And you need to sort through that just a little bit. I want to be careful here because it could start to sound like what I mean is that your faith is what makes God act. And I struggle with that concept a little bit. We certainly can come to God with a lack of assurance that he's going to do what we ask. And there are times when he moves, and we're certainly told to pray in faith. But there's an interesting passage in Mark chapter 9, verse 24, where Jesus heals a young boy. He casts a demon out of this boy. The father approaches Jesus and says, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus replies, if you can, all things are possible for the one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. And Jesus casts out the demon. Jesus affirms here that God is omnipotent and that there's nothing he can't do. And the father says, I believe, I have faith, but help me in the degree to which I don't have faith. I'm bringing you what I have at this moment. I'm bringing you all I have in faith. Help me in the ways that I fall short. Even this vulnerability in this moment is a beautiful thing to see. But the third thing we ought to see in this text is the vulnerability of Jesus' words. Take this cup from me. Jesus, who is God, is also fully human. And in this moment of the garden, in complete vulnerability, he asks for a way out. What is Jesus saying here? What is he facing? Fear, maybe? The intensity of what he knows is coming? Don't minimize the reality of what's going on here. Recognize, again, the agony of this moment for Jesus in which he sweats drops of blood. But I want us to notice here mostly is the vulnerability of Jesus. He trusts God with his real self. I'll say more about that in a few minutes, but he brings himself fully to this moment, trusting God with this moment. And the final thing that it's important for us to notice is surrender. Jesus comes with that. Yet not what I will, but what you will. Jesus ultimately comes to the Father and surrenders his will to the Father. So what's so important here is to realize that Jesus brings to the Father his real self. In all his fear and perhaps doubt and desire to sidestep what he's been called to do, it's Jesus' trust of the Father that allows him both to bring his true self to the Father and to surrender to God's will and plans for him. It's mutual love and respect. It's mutual trust that Jesus comes to the Father with. You know, God's heart for us is that we would come to him with our real selves in prayer. Let's go back to the beginning when we find God with man and woman in the garden. What does the Father teach us about prayer in the garden? Well, the first thing we know is that God places man and woman in the garden and he says, you can have it all. It's all for you. It's all for you to take care of and to enjoy, except you shall not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Genesis chapter 2, verse 17. Now the text tells us that the man and woman were created, placed in the garden, and that they were naked and unashamed. Genesis 2, verse 25. We also know, of course, that it didn't take long for them to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then they knew they were naked, and they covered themselves with fig leaves. Genesis chapter 3, verse 7. And the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. And then God comes looking for them, and they hide. What's interesting in the account here is how God handles the situation. Trevor Hudson, with whom we had a Zoom call at the end of 2020, you can see that on our virtual campus. It's titled The Gift of God's Friendship, or The Transforming Friendship. It's fantastic. I encourage you to go and watch it. But he says to us, pay attention to God's questions in scriptures. We can learn a lot from them. God comes to Adam and Eve in the garden, and he asks them a series of questions. First of all, where are you? Secondly, who told you that you are naked? And thirdly, have you eaten of the tree that I commanded you not to eat? Notice that God doesn't come accusing or scolding, though there are disciplines and consequences to their decisions. He comes questioning. He comes curious. And even in the consequence, there's grace if we look for it. There is love and compassion. In Genesis chapter 3:21, it says, and the Lord God made for Adam and Eve, they made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins and clothed them. The first animal sacrifice, this foreshadowing of what was to come in animal sacrifice. God killed the animals, and he made skins for them. He made clothes for them from the animal skins. But in their vulnerability and brokenness, God meets them and cares for them. Part of what we learn here is that vulnerability breaks down walls. By God asking them where they are and what they've done, he's giving them a chance to confess, to lay themselves open. He gives them opportunity to keep the lines of communication open. That's what confession does. It breaks down walls, and nothing poisons friendship. Nothing poisons relationship of any sort like secrets. When we keep secrets from each other in relationships, it puts up barriers and it creates trouble in our relationships. One of the interesting things to note is that in the confession, both the confession Jesus makes in the garden, there's the confession of this, take this cup from me. I don't want to go here. I don't want to do this. He was deeply troubled and hoping to find another way. It wasn't sin, but it was a confession of his real feelings in this moment. And also in the garden, where are you? Well, we were hiding because we were naked and ashamed. They aren't giving God information, they're giving God access. Think about that. They're not giving God information, they're giving God access. This was another piece of the teaching that we got from Trevor. In prayer, we don't give God information, we give God access. Now, I think we can all agree that God wasn't confused when he comes to Adam and Eve in the garden about where they were, about who told them they were naked, or whether or not they'd eaten from the tree. God knows what happened. He gives them the opportunity to bring it forth in order to keep the relationship open and working. You know, I remember back in 2007 and 2008, we lived as a family about 20 miles outside of town. It was a delightful time, really. We lived in a rented house while we were waiting to make a decision about a house and then to move into our house. And the car ride to and from town for work and sports and school with our three boys and Charlotte and myself was about a 20 to 25 minute car ride each way. And I remember one day, Johnny and I were driving into town. He's our oldest son, and I could see something was bothering him, and we were just driving. We were just being quiet in the car. You know, it's not easy being a teenager, and I know that. And sort of out of the blue, he started asking me questions about some things that he'd been thinking about, some things that had been troubling him. And, you know, as his dad, I knew he was struggling. But by waiting until he brought it up to me, I was able to have access to his life that he granted me. And it gave us a way to talk and a way to walk through some circumstances and some things that he was just kind of walking through as a young person. It allowed the conversation to be free and open because he gave me access to his life. I tell you, as a parent, there's nothing that will give you more opportunity for access into your kids' lives than time. You have to give them time and wait for the opportunities. It's a beautiful thing when it happens. But when we trust God with ourselves, we can be open and vulnerable in prayer. It's an inviting environment into which he welcomes us, and we can come with who we really are, our real selves. So let me ask you a serious question. Do you trust God with you? Can you come to God with your greatest fears, with your doubts, with your brokenness, with your confusion? In so many ways, prayer is an admission that we need help, that we can't handle it on our own, that we aren't enough. Elizabeth Payne sent me a devotional just this morning from Paul David Tripp, in which he says this: prayer is abandoning my reliance on me and running toward the rest that can be found only when I rely on the power of God. Prayer abandons independence. Prayer forsakes any thought that you can make it on your own. Prayer affirms dependency. Prayer acknowledges weakness. Prayer renounces assessments of capability. Prayer embraces the reality of failure. Prayer tells you that you are not at the center. Prayer calls you to abandon your plans for the wiser plans of another. Prayer flows from a deep personal sense of need and runs toward God's abundant grace. And so Jesus goes to the Father at this moment of his greatest need in the garden and says, I don't want to do this. Please take this cup from me. Paul says that I don't boast in my strengths. Rather, I boast in my weakness, because in my weakness I find strength. God's grace is sufficient in my weakness. In prayer, we give God access. In prayer, we open up our lives to the intimacy of divine friendship. And so, it seems often in our talk about prayer, we're talking about means or methods of prayer, or the patterns of prayer, how much time we should pray, or all those sorts of different things. But maybe what really keeps us from praying is that we're a little afraid of the vulnerability that it takes to give God access. And what that means is that our relationship with him is just shallow and thin. The level of friendship that you're looking for with God will determine your conversation with him, like any relationship. Dallas Willard says that prayer is talking to God about what we're doing together. Now, we can talk superficially with God. We can talk superficially with friends and never get very deep. Just get the surface. We can talk about the weather or favorite sports teams and never get below the real waterline of our lives with people that we know. And we can talk like that with God, just keeping it shallow, keeping it superficial. Or we can talk with friends about what we are afraid of, or where we've failed, or the fear that we're going to fail. We can talk about our insecurities and vulnerabilities, and that gives access into one another's lives. This past week, I had an opportunity to be part of a short conference with a group of spiritual directors, and one of the persons that I've become friends and colleagues with in the group is a retired State Patrol colonel. He was on the security detail for the governor of his state and the commanding officer of the State Patrol in his state before he retired. He's a pretty fantastic person. In one of the sessions, we had an opportunity to talk about what we were learning, particularly as it related to emotions that we were feeling. And the conference was a little bit about that. And he made this statement: I just realized as I've been attending this conference, and there were about 40 or 50 of us in the conference, that I'm really intimidated by this group. I don't have the same background, the same foundational training, the same education, and I just need to say that I feel very intimidated by this group. I also want to say that I've been in a lot of sticky situations over my career, and not very much intimidates me. It was a really interesting moment of vulnerability. And I suspect that for everyone hearing him in that group, there were two responses. The first was surprise, because he doesn't seem like a guy who would be easily intimidated. The second is immediate endearment. No doubt it took some trust of the others in that room to be able to say it, but it made room for others to say, you're loved and accepted and deeply appreciated and welcomed. That was the response of the group. But him saying it was more about freeing himself than anything, because nobody thought in that group that he was lesser. It's the vulnerability that he had that gave him the freedom to continue in that relationship in a deeper way. And God is looking for that type of vulnerability from us. He's looking for access. And it may be that one of the things blocking your prayer life is that you're hiding from God. There are things that you don't want to open up to him about. Maybe it's because of your image of him, and it might take some work to work through that. Maybe it's the shame that you feel because of habits or failures or your behaviors or falling short in some area. Maybe it's a matter of not feeling like you measure up compared to other people. Maybe you feel like God's love is something you have to earn and you haven't been doing enough to earn it. You have to work through those issues in order to find that space where you can come to him vulnerably in prayer. God's heart is to walk in intimate relationship with us. And one of the keys of that intimate relationship is communication. And key to our communication with God is prayer. And one of the keys to prayer is a willingness to open our lives wide and give God access. You know, we cannot become a house of prayer until the people who live in the house are people of prayer. So I want to encourage you to consider how prayer is working in your life. Here are some questions for reflections and some next steps. First, what is your primary idea about God and the associated images? How do you see God? Take some time in the coming week to think about that. Think it through, maybe even write it out. Your primary idea about God and its associated image will drive your communication with him. And it may be that your image of God is blocking communication. And maybe you even need to find somebody to talk to about that. Then Trevor Hudson says this, that one question that he finds really interesting as he talks to people is this question: what aren't you talking to God about? When Trevor asked me this question, it was a really jarring question. I had to think through that. What am I not talking to God about? And why am I not talking to him about those things? What don't you talk to God about that's bothering you or causing you trouble? And why? And then what would you like to talk to God about, but just haven't? You just haven't yet done there. Something's stopping you. What's stopping you? And then are there areas of your life that you feel like God is disappointed about, that he isn't interested in talking with you about? Or that you would be judged or dismissed by him? And then, are there areas of shame in your life that are causing you to hide from God? I want to invite you to take a risk, to clear the decks, to bring to him anything on your mind and trust him with it. Open your life and give him access. He is worthy of your trust. He wants you to draw near, and he's inviting you to draw near in surrender. I want to invite you as I close to just pray this prayer of relinquishment with me. Today, O Lord, I yield myself to you. May your will be my delight today. May your way have perfect sway in me. May your love be the pattern of my living. I surrender to you my hopes, my dreams, my ambitions. Do with them what you will, when you will, as you will. I place into your loving care my family, my friends, my future. Care for them with a care that I can never give. I release into your hands my need for control, my craving for status, my fear of obscurity. Eradicate the evil, purify the good, and establish your kingdom on earth for Jesus' sake. Amen. God bless you.